Just doing the final setup on YouTube before opening the event.
Good morning. We'll get started in just a minute here. You're on the Watt Coalition release of a new report called Unlocking the Queue. We'll have remarks from Chair Castor here, as well as an all-star panel of our favorite industry and policymaker leaders. The Watt Coalition, I'll just say, as a few more people are joining, is a coalition of currently 6 advanced technology companies. You can find more about it at watt-transmission.org. We've been together for 3 years, and I think collectively the group found a need to elevate the prominence and public attention around these technologies that have become commercially available. Some of them actually came out of the ARPA-E program, but the deployment within the electric utility industry never went as fast, at least in the United States, as we thought it should. In other countries with different incentives, deployment has been going faster. So the coalition's working at FERC and with Congress and others to try to raise attention and change utility incentives and work on transmission planning to incorporate grid enhancing technologies. And we'll say more about the technologies when we get into the presentation, but for now, we have a few minutes. We're very fortunate to have Chair Castor with us. Kathy Castor is a Democrat from the Florida 14th District, the Tampa area. As far as I can tell, she's never lost by, or never won by less than 20 points in her election. So she's been around for 16 years or so, and looks like we'll be around for a long time. But she's on the very important House Energy and Commerce, Energy and Power Subcommittee, as well as the chair of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which is where we interacted. Their excellent report, staff report on the climate crisis and all of the things that need to be done for climate. Includes many things, but one of the building blocks is increasing transmission capacity and efficiency, and that talks about grid enhancing technology. So she's a leader on this issue, and we really appreciate that attention. And for that, we welcome you, Chair Castor, and look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. It's great to join Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies, the whole coalition, at the release of your report. Thank you for mentioning the work of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and our major report last year, our Climate Crisis Action Plan. And I want to give a shout out to Fatima Ahmad, who is one of our senior advisors and is on this webinar today. She's outstanding, and thank you for your input in helping us develop our policy recommendations. But this is a very important time to be discussing how we upgrade and expand the electric grid in America. It's never been more urgent. As we speak, there are many families in Texas who are recovering from an energy and humanitarian crisis. My heart goes out to those families. I'm heartened to see that the energy and water situation there is starting to stabilize, but we need to make sure that this never happens again. And I'm grateful that Watt has answers on unlocking the queue with grid enhancing technologies and renewables. A lot of what is happening in Texas can be attributed to a lack of preparedness. In short, the state failed to make vital investments in their grid. They failed to invest in the infrastructure that can withstand extreme weather. So everyone must learn from this lesson and do more to prepare for these costly climate impacts. Extreme weather events like what happened in Texas are becoming more common, whether it's winter storms or extreme heat or wildfires. These climate impacts are impacting everyone, and it's costing us a lot of money to respond. So that's why it's important for us to invest in the resilience of our energy system. But we should be clear, the crisis in Texas demonstrates that we need more clean energy, not less. And as the crisis unfolded, some of my GOP friends tried to blame all kinds of boogeymen to try to skirt responsibility for the lack of preparedness. But we all know that clean energy did not cause the power failure in Texas. In fact, the early data shows that the blackouts were mainly caused by losing generation from natural gas and coal plants, and because of problems at those plants and with the fuel supplies. These plants had not been weatherized or upgraded in ways that could have helped the grid withstand this extreme event. And improvements were recommended years ago, but they did not follow through. So with time, we'll get to the bottom of those failures so we can ensure that this does not happen again. But what we know is we need more clean energy and more investments in resilience. And we cannot wait for another disaster to strike before we take action. That's why, along with President Biden, we have a plan to invest in stronger infrastructure and improve grid resilience. Bring in these modern tools to help strengthen our entire system. We already took an important first step. We elected a president who puts the public interests over the special interests. We now have an entire US government that is committed to climate solutions and is looking at major investments in clean energy and modernization of the grid. Look no further than President Biden's who President Biden tapped to lead the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Richard Glick. We're so excited about Chairman Glick's leadership and the solutions that he and FERC will move forward. But they're going to need everyone's help. So this Watt report comes at a very good time. So how do we unlock the incredible potential of the grid? I think it boils down to making progress on two fronts. Looking at what's in front of us and updating existing infrastructure to make sure it's resilient to climate impacts, and looking to the future and quickly ramping up renewable clean energy sources and expanding the grid so that every American has access to these clean resources. Making good on these goals will create lasting benefits for so many Americans and businesses, including their health, their jobs, and their pocketbooks. And we know that bringing more renewable energy online is within our reach. There's been study after study recently that demonstrates this. And we're blessed in America to have abundant renewable resources, from wind on the Great Plains to solar energy in Florida. We have the means to power our grid, power our communities with cleaner energy. But hundreds of gigawatts of wind energy, solar power, and energy storage projects are stuck waiting to connect to the electric grid in interconnection queues. So our next step is to clear out these queues and get zero emission electricity to as many homes and businesses as we can. And that's why I'm excited about the release of the Unlocking the Queue report today. We need creative ways to connect our abundant renewable energy resources to the grid and help make clean energy a reality for families all across the country. Now, last Congress, in our Solving the Climate Crisis Action Plan, we consulted, in development of that plan, we consulted with hundreds of experts, businesses, unions, environmental groups, community groups. It has been called the most well thought out plan for addressing climate change that's ever been part of US politics. And thanks to those of you out there who provided input. But now the task is clear. We've got to enact those policy recommendations into law. And they need to be bipartisan, and they need to be durable, passed into law, and not done through executive action if we can help it. On interconnection queues, we heard two things. One, our current system places all the cost and burdens of network upgrades on developers, and that isn't working. And two, we also don't seem to be taking advantage of the important grid enhancing technologies that are already available today and could reduce cost and make the grid more efficient. And I can tell you, most members of Congress don't have electrical engineering degrees. I think if you remember a year or two ago when we were examining big tech and Facebook, it became clear that members of Congress don't have a lot of sophistication when it comes to technological issues. That's why we need you all to press policymakers, help educate us, inform us about what is out there, what is existing, and the fact that these grid enhancing technologies can provide short-term relief from grid congestion while we figure out the larger strategy to build new transmission lines. This shouldn't be an issue that gets bogged down in partisan politics. I hope not. We already have the technology today that can more closely monitor transmission lines to improve their performance, control electricity flow to ease congestion, and use software to reconfigure the electric grid to avoid areas of congestion. So we want to keep working on those solutions to bring down the cost, to adopt new technologies, and expand access to clean energy. Our Climate Crisis Action Plan did call on FERC to encourage deployment of advanced transmission technologies and to incentivize the kinds of technologies that we need to improve capacity and efficiency of the bulk electric transmission system. But we also want to make sure that these benefits are helping everyday Americans in tangible ways. That's what's most exciting about this new report. It shows an incredible economic benefit to enhance what enhancing our grid will do for families and businesses across this country. Just in Kansas and Oklahoma, the report identifies cost savings of $175 million per year and an investment that would be paid back within 6 months. And not to mention other benefits like the creation of local jobs, increased tax revenues, reduced greenhouse gas pollution, and doubling new renewable energy capacity within 5 years. It's such a win-win for American families and communities. And this is just in 2 states. Imagine what we could do if we deployed these technologies nationwide. That's the task ahead of us. So I'm really excited about the conversation we're having today. And I look forward to continuing to explore these solutions, enacting them into law, answering the moral obligation we have to our kids and future generations to tackle the climate crisis. So Rob and everyone at Watt, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor. We really appreciate your leadership, and I know your team is working hard to follow through on the excellent report with a number of legislative provisions to really make it all a reality and work with Chairman Glick at FERC. And of course, we're hearing great things from Secretary Designee Granholm, hopefully soon to be Secretary Granholm at DOE. So thank you again for your participation here. Hang out as long as you like, but I know you've got to get going. Mentioning policymakers in the press release, you may want to take a look at, we have comments from Senator Heinrich, who actually is an electrical engineer and elected representative. So he's done a lot on the Senate side, and Chair Castor's colleague, Congressman Caston, on the House side, also made a comment, and Michael Skelly, the famous large-scale transmission developer and subject of the book Superpower, talks about how large-scale transmission and grid-enhancing technologies are completely complementary with each other. And former FERC Chairman John Wellinghoff added a quote about what FERC can do. I should note, we're making this bipartisan, and as always, we'll have former Commissioner Nora Brownell here, appointed by George W. Bush to FERC, and somebody I worked with closely during those years. And so we're hopeful that these ideas catch on both sides of the aisle and at all the relevant agencies. So now, I think without any further ado, we should talk about the report, which we're very excited. I should have said I'm Rob Gramlich, and one of my roles is I serve as Executive Director of the Watt Coalition, and also I have a consulting firm, Grid Strategies, and we brought on Jay Casper recently to Grid Strategies. He's going to talk through the report here. Jay has almost 40 years of electric industry engineering, transmission planning, and various other roles across the utility sector. And he spent a number of years at the Southwest Power Pool. So when Chair Castor talks about these high penetrations of wind, he saw that up close and personal, and still works with his former colleagues at SPP and other RTOs on how to reliably integrate large amounts of renewable energy. So with that, I think, Jay, we'll turn it to you to talk through the report. And then after that, we'll have Jenny Irwin and the panelists talk a little more about it.
Sounds great. Can everybody hear me okay?
Just fine. Yep.
Super. Thanks, Chair Castor, and thanks, Rob, for the introduction. I'm Jay Casper. I'm with Grid Strategies, and it's an honor and a pleasure to share the highlights of this report with you today. This report, and actually the scope of this study, was one of the reasons I actually joined Grid Strategies back last fall. It's exciting to work with people that understand technology and how it can be used to improve the performance of the grid. What I'd like to do, and it's exciting for me to be live on YouTube. I don't think I've ever done that before. And I see there's 175 people here and probably more that are going to watch this later. It's too bad there's so much going on in our industry. I know that SPP has the Generation Interconnection User Forum going on right now. And I imagine there's probably 50 to 100 people at that meeting right now that would like to hear this. And I look forward to their input after they review the recording. So I do want to go into the report, but before I do, on the next slide, I'd like to thank the sponsors. And I guess before I do that, I need to acknowledge Bruce Toshida, who spent a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears on this project, along with his staff, Stephanie Ross and Adam Bigelow at the Watt Coalition at Brattle. We spent a lot of time over the Thanksgiving and Christmas break working on these models and the analysis so that we could get this report out here in early 2021. But I got to thank the sponsors. These are some great companies, and if you don't know them, you need to look up their websites and see what they're doing. They're all doing great things in this space of improving the grid and getting more renewables onto the grid in a cost-effective manner. Grid Lab was the primary sponsor of this study, and we're really fortunate to have EDF Renewables North America that helped out, as well as NextEra Energy Resources and Duke Energy Renewables. I'm really excited that Radhika from EDF Renewables is on our panel, and will share some of her own experiences in this space in terms of deploying the technologies. So I've got about 20 minutes, and I want to go through basically a handful, about 10 or 12 of the slides that are out there publicly available today. And I'm only going to be scratching the surface of this report. I'd encourage you to to actually pull it up, look at it, give us comments, concerns. Let's talk about it. If you got comments now, I'd encourage you to throw them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll grab them and follow up with you later. On the next slide, I'll just go through a really quick agenda. And but I really want to talk about the issue at hand and the case for action. Why are we even doing this study? Why are we looking at Kansas and Oklahoma renewables that are basically stuck in the queue and have not made commitments to interconnect to the system? Talk about the overview and the approach of the study. We actually shared the study scope and approach with the Economic Studies Working Group at Southwest Power Pool back on February 4th. Bruce Tashida helped a lot with going through the details of the methodology and what we did to the modeling. And we look forward to actually now sharing the results and then furthering that dialogue and that conversation with you and others who are interested in it. So we'll actually share the results for the first time today. And I'm sure there's going to be much more follow-up in terms of that. So let's go forward and talk about the issue at hand and the case for action. We all know that there's a big push to get more and more clean energy on the grid. A lot of interest by private entities, whether that's utilities or corporations or institutions, to get to decarbonized energy sources. We see that all over the nation and even all over the world. And it's not just at the local level with cities are doing it or counties, but it's also at the state and federal levels. It's all over. It's amazing to me, the commitments that have been made to get to 80% lower carbon by 2030, or even some of the Biden goals of getting to 100% renewable by 2035. That's very aggressive. And we can do it. I mean, if we can put a man on the moon, we can do this, and we need to work together to make it happen. Also, the benefits of these projects, these renewable projects, are large scale. You know, transmission enables and defines markets, but it provides tremendous opportunities to move clean energy across the nation. And we've seen that in the SEAM study. We've seen that in all these other recent reports on the value of building out the grid. It actually is a prerequisite if we actually want a clean energy future that's cost effective. We have to be able to take advantage of these really high quality renewable resources across our nation and move them. And we can do that with the macro grid, and we can do that with a lot more interregional transmission. But this map here is a recent a diagram from the Smart Electric Power Alliance that shows where territories and utilities have made significant announcements to reduce the carbon in their footprint. Let's go forward. We all know about that. And there's also other roadblocks that we're experiencing in integrating renewables. The biggest one is getting transmission built. It takes so long to build large-scale transmission projects that I don't know if we can wait for that. And I think that's where grid enhancing technologies fits in here. Last year was a record year at Southwest Power Pool. You know, when I started there in 2001, there were 0 utility scale wind farms on the grid. Within several years, we started a regional market, I guess 10 years later, and then and looked at doing things differently in terms of our operations to effectively integrate more and more amounts of renewables. Back in 2006 and 7, we hired Brattle to do a wind integration study for Southwest Power Pool. And at that time, we were looking at 20, 30, and 40% penetrations on the system. We even had a problem solving the 40% scenarios in the models. And so that just shows you how far we've come. Last year, wind was a leading energy resource in the SPP market, more than coal. And it's projected to even increase. And the other thing, at least in Southwest Power Pool, and I think in other markets, is the significant inrush of new solar projects, as well as hybrid solar and battery projects, as well as wind and battery projects that are being proposed to take advantage and time shift that energy so that we can move it around. But transmission is the constraint. And if you look at the GIQs, you'll see 750,000 megawatts of renewables that are under study or stuck in the queues. There's a huge timing gap. These renewables could be developed in a matter of 12 to 18 months, much faster than transmission lines, which take 5 to 10 to 15 plus years. It really depends on the challenges with permitting and siting. We all know that utility scale renewables are very cost efficient right now. They're very competitive with gas resources, and obviously cheaper than coal. So we're going to see more and more renewables try to get on the system. And the way that we think we can do this quickly and cost effectively is through grid enhancing technologies. We can use this to take full advantage of the existing infrastructure. We're going to talk a little bit about that in upcoming slides. Let's move on to the next slide if we can. So the goal of this study was to basically identify how many additional renewables that are stuck in the queue could we add to the power system in a reliable manner using grid enhancing technologies. Grid enhancing technologies really improve transmission operations and the market efficiencies in the near term, but they can also help the planning processes. One thing that I'm really excited about in terms of like dynamic line ratings is the sensors that are used to monitor the actual performance of the conductor and the towers and the clearances and all of that. The data that you can get through these sensors is really valuable. And it not only helps today's decisions or the real-time value of the rating of the line, but also what could be available tomorrow in terms of transmission capacity forecasting. The algorithms are really good right now, and they improve every day in terms of dynamic line ratings. In addition, you can also get algorithms and data from the dynamic line rating sensors to understand the condition of the assets, to help with better maintenance and long-term capacity planning purposes, to get the right transmission expansion projects in your portfolio. So DLR is a hot topic. It's at the FERC right now with the NOPR on managing line ratings, and it'll be very interesting to see how that comes out. But dynamic line ratings are basically just using available information to know exactly how much capacity is available in that transmission line before you overheat it and before it sags too much. Other grid enhancing technologies include advanced power flow controllers. The industry has used FACT devices and phase shifting transformers and phase angle regulators over decades to help shift the power flows across interfaces and critical lines. It wasn't that long ago that SPP added a rather large phase shifting transformer out in western Oklahoma at Woodward to actually manage the congestion that was forecasted in that area due to wind farms being added to the system. But the second wind speed 345 kV line to Oklahoma City was being delayed a little bit. So they added a transformer that would actually shift the impedance of the power system and force the flows off of the underlying 138 kV system to get them back up onto the 345 kV system where there's much more capacity. Advanced power flow controllers are very similar. They change the effective impedance of the transmission system in a way that you can add impedance, which would become an increased barrier to flows and actually lower the flows on critical elements. Or you could actually lower the impedance of a transmission line that would actually pull power from other lines across underutilized facilities. The last type of grid enhancing technology that we look at in this study is topology optimization. And this is a software solution that's been developed through ARRA. And we've actually done case studies at Southwest Power Pool several years ago that have been published, where we actually looked at how could you reconfigure the existing transmission system to get flows off of congested lines and overloaded lines and onto other parts of the system just through switching operations, and still maintain reliability criteria and other constraints you want to impose on the system in terms of we're only going to allow 30 megawatts of load to be radialized under these conditions. Topology optimization has been used by operators for years. They haven't done it in a systematic and automatic way to help inform decisions. They kind of do it as a one-off. But I think you're going to see more and more of interest in reconfiguring the existing system to allow us to take advantage of latent capacity on the rest of the grid without jeopardizing security or reliability in any way. Let's go forward to the next slide and talk a little bit about the overview of the study. So the goal of this study was to analyze how much additional renewables that are in the queue could we add using grid enhancing technologies. We decided to focus on a region or sub-region within Southwest Power Pool of Kansas and Oklahoma, and we decided to look at conditions under 2025 projections and models. The map on the right there is a little old. It's from the late 90s when SPP was just setting up its regional tariff. But it actually shows a lot of balancing authorities that don't exist today. Things have been consolidated and rebranded, but this is the area we're going to focus on. But I do remember after SPP did install the regional tariff back in the late 90s, we actually saw significant changes in flows on the system, and this is way before renewables. And as a result, there were constraints on the system between the Lacine power plant in southeast Kansas and the Kansas City metropolitan area. There were constraints. And actually, KCPL at the time, which was a co-owner of that plant and with Westar and others, they decided to install dynamic line ratings on that line because the flows were much higher as we operated a regional transmission tariff compared to what happened when we had individual balancing authorities doing their own scheduling for service to their own loads. So it's exciting to me that here we are about 20 years later, where we're talking about using new types of dynamic line ratings to actually facilitate more and more transactions that are needed. Within the existing SPP queue, and that the queue at SPP is probably 100 gigawatts of renewables yet to be studied, and there's about 9.4 gigawatts of renewable resources which actually have a signed interconnection agreement within the states of Kansas and Oklahoma. So this study is actually going to look at those resources which have gone through the study process and see how many of those could we effectively integrate into the system without violating reliability criteria. Fortunately, a lot of the constraints in these models and these simulations are thermal and voltage issues. We don't get into stability issues, which are much more complicated. But one of the reasons we looked at this was also because in the integrated transmission planning reports back in 2019, SPP staff identified significant congestion in southeast Kansas and southwest Missouri, as well as eastern and central Oklahoma. So that's one of the reasons that we decided to focus on this area. And we're going to look at some metrics too of these combined applications of these grid enhancing technologies, and the order that you deploy these technologies matters. So we're not sharing detailed results of each technology, but we're looking at the aggregate benefits of all these technologies. And it really is important in the order in which you study them, because if you do DLR first versus topology optimization first, obviously you're going to use DLR more than if you did use one of the other grid enhancing technologies. But we're going to look at the renewables that could be added in terms of capacity and energy, as well as the economic benefits to the region, there's a sub-region actually, in terms of production cost savings, investment, jobs, and things like that, as well as the carbon emission reductions. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the study approach. And this gets really complicated, and there's a lot more details in the report, but I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of this. What we actually did was to look at snapshots of actual SPP operations back in 2019 through 2020. And we grabbed 25 of these scenarios and looked at them and tried to find representative scenarios of actual EMS models and market solutions that had comparable amounts of wind curtailment as a function of time. So there's going to be a lot of cases where there's very little wind curtailment and a few cases that have a lot of wind curtailment. But what we were looking for is 24 representative snapshots on the system that we could update to reflect 2025 conditions. What we did is take these snapshots, these actual operating models from 19 and 20, and added all of the approved transmission upgrades, as well as generation projects and retirements and load changes even that were anticipated and expected to happen over the course of the next 5 to 6 years to create 2025 models. When we created these scenarios too, and these snapshots, we wanted to have a balance. We wanted ideally to have 6 snapshots for each season. We'd have 6 in the spring and the fall and the winter and the summer. We couldn't do that, but we were close. We actually ended up with, I think, 4 in the winter and 8 in the fall, and with 6 in the summer and the spring. And we wanted it to be balanced out over time too. We didn't want all of these to be in the early morning hours where you typically see tremendous amounts of wind curtailments in SPP given the weather patterns. So we had a mix of, early morning cases or midday cases or late afternoon or late evening cases, so we could get a representative sample of what we could expect in 2025 to happen based on approved plans. For those new updated models, we created a baseline, which is basically how much of the existing 9.4 gigawatts of signed IAs could be integrated into the system under those snapshots and not violate voltage and thermal criteria. So we ran a lot of security constrained power flows to create those base models. And then above and beyond that, we started deploying sequentially each of the grid enhancing technologies. First, we deployed dynamic line ratings. Second, we looked at topology optimization on top of that, and then advanced power flow controllers on top of that. And we actually reiterated back to find if there were any more headroom and additional resources we could get onto the system without violating reliability standards as one last pass for each of those 24 power flow cases. So we ran lots and lots and lots of security constrained optimal power flows. And then at the end of the day, we wanted to assess the benefits and the cost of deploying the technologies, as well as the local impact to jobs and other benefits in terms of environmental and taxes and things like that. So that's our study approach. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. So again, we're trying to quantify the benefits of these 3 grid enhancing technologies combined for this study area within Southwest Power Pool. Again, Kansas and Oklahoma. Almost all the resources in these models, the new potential resources are wind, very small fraction of that is solar. But for each of these scenarios, we did a lot of analysis, and again, a lot of security constrained optimal power flows were done at Brattle to determine how many of these renewable projects were viable. And a big part of that is not just finding where the transmission congestion was that grid enhancing technologies could solve, but we had to also deal with a lot of minimum generation constraints for the other resources in the models. And we were pretty conservative in terms of redispatch too. We didn't touch the nuclear units, and we didn't touch imports and exports within SPP. So all of that was fixed. And we were looking at what could we do with the other resources that were dispatched in each of those 24 scenarios. And then how many renewables could we bring onto the system. And one other key thing about this study is this 5% curtailment threshold for viability assessment. So if there were wind farms or solar projects that would see significant curtailments as a result of being injected into the system, we actually eliminated them from the mix. So this analysis actually looked at marginal improvements to wind injections and solar project injections up to a 5% curtailment threshold. So if a project had more than 5% congestion on it and curtailment, it wasn't considered viable. So that eliminates a lot of the projects. And the reason for that is we need major transmission investments and upgrades to deal with projects that have that significant amount of overloads on the system. With that, I'd like to go forward to the next slide and start to get into some of the results. I think this is the exciting part. And I hope you have questions and start throwing things into the Q&A in the chat. So as I mentioned before, if you look at the top right, you can see how many potential renewable projects are in the queue that have signed IAs. And as you can see, there's 3.4 gigawatts of wind and 120 megawatts of solar in Kansas for about 3.5 gigawatts of potential projects. And we have a little bit more than that in Oklahoma. We got almost 5.8 gigawatts of wind projects with signed IAs in Oklahoma, and about a comparable amount of solar for a nice round 5.9 gigawatts of potential projects in Oklahoma that were added to these models. As you can see, the total got up to 9.4 gigawatts of potential renewables across both states. The majority of that are wind projects with signed IAs. So we developed the base cases I mentioned, and then we started looking at the potential benefits of the grid enhancing technologies. As you can see in the base case of that 9.4 gigawatts of potential projects, we could effectively integrate 2.58 gigawatts of projects. The majority of those were new wind projects in Kansas and some wind and a little bit of solar in Oklahoma. You see 1.7 gigawatts of new wind in Kansas and about 0.9 gigawatts of wind and solar projects in Oklahoma. Now that's in the base case with 2025 conditions forecasted in terms of load and resources and new transmission projects. And it's not just transmission projects that SPP customers are paying for. It's actually all projects. A good example of that is the Jaybird or Jayhawk Wind sponsored upgrade project in Kansas. Here's a wind farm that's got a constraint and is offered to pay for a project that's been approved and is actually in the plans for SPP, but it's not being paid for by SPP customers. It's being paid for by that wind developer to help their outlet. So projects like that are there, along with a billion or two other projects that have been approved under the SPP regional planning, as well as generation interconnection and transmission service processes. And one thing you notice is the middle case, that with the grid enhancing technologies in aggregate here, we see that we can integrate basically twice as much of the renewables that are in the queue today in SPP using dynamic line ratings, topology control, as well as topology optimization. And you can see that the grid enhancing technologies don't have a significant effect on the additional amount of renewables in Kansas. They're only increasing by about 200 megawatts. But if you look in Oklahoma, these technologies have tremendous amount of benefits where we can add 2.4 gigawatts of additional wind in Oklahoma and 40 megawatts of additional solar to add about 2.5 gigawatts of additional renewables in Oklahoma with the technology. And if you add up the Kansas impacts, you're getting up to 2.7 gigawatts of additional resources that can be added to the models and keep the system reliable and still within criteria by using dynamic line ratings, topology control, and advanced power flow controllers. So that's the high level results, 2x. That's a big number. But what does that mean? And let's talk about that more in the next slide. As we mentioned, the grid enhancing technologies allow us to integrate twice as many new renewables onto the system. So we're getting 2.67 gigawatts of new renewables added to the system, which add up to about 8.8 terawatt hours of new renewable energy over the course of a year. And here are some assumptions about the amount of new energy you'd get out of each of these resources by type. The 2.6 gigawatts of new wind would produce 8.7 terawatt hours of energy over the course of a year. And the wind, you see similar amounts or calculations for the amount of solar energy that we could enable as a result of new grid enhancing technologies. So the grid enhancing technologies not only help new resources get on the system, they actually help reduce the curtailments of existing wind on SPP2. It's an integrated system, so it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that the existing wind farms also benefit from these technologies, which are being used primarily to enable new wind and solar resources to get on the SPP system in Oklahoma and Kansas. We've estimated that the cost of installing these resources is about $90 million one time, with annual O&M costs about 10% or $10 million per year. And we're estimating right now that in Kansas and Oklahoma for this 2025 study, we're projecting $175 million of annual production cost savings associated with the new renewable energy that would be on the system. And we costed that at $20 a megawatt hour, which is kind of conservative. It's actually lower than the actual LMP on the SPP system over the course of the year. But it's not just cost savings, it's jobs. So we estimate that installing these grid enhancing technologies would enable a lot of big renewable projects to be built. And the majority of these projects benefits in terms of jobs are due to new wind farms and new solar projects that would be built. You can see there's 11,000 short-term jobs and 650 long-term jobs as a result of this technology. We also looked at local benefits in terms of land leases and tax revenues. You know, $15 million of land leases to local owners of land that would be used for siting primarily new wind farms in Kansas and Oklahoma, as well as tax revenues to local counties to help out with schools and whatever. You know, we've all seen the stories of how renewable projects have greatly enhanced the viability of some of these communities in Western Kansas and Oklahoma that it's revitalized the economy and helped a lot. And also reduce carbon emissions. If we could get more renewables on our system, we project that we'd have a reduction of about 3 million tons of CO2 just in the SPP region for this case study in 2025. Let's go on to the third slide of the results. And this is, a lot of this is repetitive. Again, grid enhancing technologies allow us to integrate twice as many new renewables compared to what we could without them. The estimated savings are $175 million. Again, $90 million of cost, half a year payback, so it's significant. The jobs we've talked about before, as well as the carbon emission reductions, as well as the local benefits in terms of tax revenues and land leases. So let's go forward to slide 4, and I'm going to wrap this up in a couple more slides. So here are the results on the left for Kansas and Oklahoma. What if we extrapolated this across the United States? And what we've done is a rather simplistic calculation, but it's probably representative of what the national impact would be of grid enhancing technologies on an annual basis. If we looked at EIA data and looked at how Kansas and Oklahoma generation compared to the rest of the generation across the across the U.S. If you take the production cost savings in Kansas and Oklahoma and extrapolate it, it would be about $5.3 billion of production cost savings if we deployed grid enhancing technologies across the U.S. And you extrapolate the 3 million tons of CO2 in Oklahoma and Kansas, it's 90 million tons of reduced carbon emissions, which would basically offset all new cars sold in the U.S. for an entire year. It's a significant amount. In terms of local benefits, taxes, and land leases, we'd get $1.5 billion. In terms of jobs, if you extrapolate it, we'd get 330,000 short-term jobs for the first year and 20,000 long-term jobs to maintain the equipment and make sure that the data and the algorithms are working and actually utilizing the grid the way we should. Let's move on to the last slide in terms of the summary of the study results. Then I'm going to hand this over to the panel. So one of the detailed questions people are going to have, and the details are in the report, is how many of these technologies are you deploying and at what voltages and where are they at? Are they in substations or on lines? So with respect to dynamic line ratings, we identified 56 lines within Kansas and Oklahoma that would be good candidates for DLR. As you can see, it's spread across the voltage classes in SPP. The majority of them are at 138 kV and then 161 and then 345 kV lines. In addition, we looked at advanced power flow controllers and we identified 8 optimal locations for those. Keep in mind that we looked at advanced power flow controllers as the third option in this optimization effort. Had we looked at advanced power flow controllers as the first option, we'd obviously have a lot more of those. But we've identified 8 applications of advanced power flow controllers to adjust the impedance of lines to push and pull more power across existing assets. In terms of topology optimizations and reconfigurations, we identified 204 unique topology optimization reconfigurations over these 24 models that were extrapolated. You can see the majority of the switching operations, again, are at the 138 kV level, with the next tier at the 161, followed by the 69 kV. So we were looking at optimization solutions all the way down to 69 kV, and that's important to know that when we did the SCOPF, the security constrained power flow, we wanted to make sure we maintained reliability standards on the 69 kV and up within SPP, as well as 100 kV and up in adjacent systems. So that's a summary of the results and the technologies that were deployed in this case study. I think the last slide I have is simply an outline of the table of contents and the report. It's about a 60-page report that I'd encourage you to go in and look at, ask questions. Please give us feedback. I really look forward to talking to you, and I'm excited about the panel. Jenny's got a great group of folks to talk about. So what does this mean? But there's my contact information, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jay. And thank you to Chair Castor and Rob for setting the scene. My name is Jenny Irwin, and I'm the chair of the WATT Coalition. On that coalition, I represent SmartWires, which is a global power technology company. And we have a fantastic panel of speakers today who are ready to share their insights and perspectives on grid enhancing technologies. After their opening comments, we'll have a Q&A discussion, so be sure to submit your questions in the chat feature. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. First, we'll hear from Radhika Donaldson. Radhika is the Senior Director of Transmission Strategy at EDF Renewables North America. In this role, Radhika leads the group responsible for forecasting and mitigating transmission congestion and curtailment risk for EDF Renewables assets. And Radhika has been with the EDF group for the past 13 years. Then we'll hear from Nora Brownell. Nora is the co-founder of SB Energy Solutions. And as Rob mentioned earlier, Nora previously served on FERC for a 5-year term after being nominated by President George W. Bush. Before her time at FERC, Nora served on the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. And Nora has also served as NARUC president and on the boards of several large utilities across the US. Then we'll hear from Dr. Al Tamimi. Dr. Tamimi is Sunflower Electric's Vice President of Transmission Planning, Policy, and Compliance, and has been at Sunflower Electric since 2001. He currently serves on the NRECA Transmission and Substation Assets Group and several SPP working groups. In 2014, he was elevated to the grade of senior member within IEEE. And finally, Rudy Winter. Rudy is President and COO of Wholesale Networks and US Capital Delivery at National Grid. And in this role, Rudy is leading the transformation of the company's transmission network into an intelligent, resilient system that will meet their customers' long-term needs and help enable the clean energy future. And in April, Rudy will become the president of National Grid's New York business. So without further ado, Radhika, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny, and hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel. EDF Renewable is not only a large developer of clean energy facilities, but we also want to see and be a partner to stakeholders in the power sector and to the communities where we develop our projects. So EDF Renewables has become a very strong advocate for grid enhanced technologies. And I would say we see benefits of those technologies, both in regards to optimizing the existing grid, but also when we look at the future grid, some of those technologies could be coupled with traditional upgrades to improve and add additional benefits to the system. And why we are also seeing those technologies as potentially temporary solutions to address congestion pending more permanent upgrades. Jay mentioned a transmission build, a transmission line can take many years to get built. So to give more background on why EDF Renewables has become such a strong proponent of those technologies, I'll mention a few items. First, it has been mentioned earlier by that interconnection queue processes are chronically delayed and even dysfunctional in many RTOs. So I won't talk a lot on this, but that's a key reason why we are supporting of anything that can unlock renewables, and grid enhanced technologies are definitely part of the solution. Second, as mentioned earlier, a new transmission line can take a lot of years from the identification of the need to being permitted and put in place. And oftentimes from our experience across RTOs in the US, sometimes by the time a new upgrade is in place, the congestion real time, it's already severe. So again, those grid enhanced technologies can become either a bridge solution to address congestion until a permanent fix is there, or can be coupled for more effective solutions and longer term solutions. And lastly, I would say that our interest is also driven by the fact that a renewable project doesn't remains under a lot of congestion and transmission risk even after the project is online. So the risk doesn't end after we go through those interconnection queue processes and it has been determined that it can be reliably integrated to the grid. With all our operational experience, we see that there are a lot of constraints and the grid is very dynamic and it's very constrained. You have grid outages all the time, and those grid outages can exacerbate existing constraints, non-constraints, or they can lead to new constraints. And traditionally, we have done, like PROMA studies. For those of you who are in industry, you know what PROMA is, one of those sophisticated models that mimic the wholesale market. So we try to the best of our ability to forecast the congestion risk, both medium term and longer term. We have looked at sponsor upgrades. Jay mentioned a sponsor upgrade in SPP. We have done that as well in SPP, but there is more to do because the congestion risk is real and is very painful to many of us here in the renewable industry. And I will note that the landscape has changed considerably over the last few years with the emergence of a new customer segment, corporates, which are great partners for us in the industry, but those contracts also put a lot more congestion risk onto projects because contractually the output is delivered or settled at a central location that is different than the project point of interconnection. In the industry, we call that basis risk, but essentially the contracts put a lot more exposure onto renewable projects. And you may say, oh, this is a cost to generators, but it's also a cost ultimately to ratepayers, because anytime when you have a constraint in the system, low cost energy cannot be delivered to loads. So in this new environment with a lot more risk due to the nature of the state of the grids in many RTOs, and also with contractually having more risk, we at EDF started looking at those grid enhanced technologies. And I'm happy to say that we have partnered with several WAC Coalition members. For instance, in the topology optimization area, we work with New Grid, which is a WAC Coalition member, to look at for specific constraints, sometimes local or regional, can there be a solution? Can there be a reconfiguration solution? And it's been stunning to see that for virtually all the constraints we'll look at, there could be a reconfiguration solution. And those are very low cost. I mean, basically almost no cost, and can be implemented very fast. So we feel like there is a missed opportunity here for addressing congestion in real time, that all of us could benefit from. The system, the consumers paying less because congestion costs ultimately go to ratepayers. And we also partner with smart wires. Jay mentioned smart switches to look at the potential of those technologies to address thermal constraints. We are looking now even in Texas for their potential to potentially address stability constraints. Many of you who work and operate in ERCOT, you understand the risk of GTCs, general transmission constraints. So we have seen via our studies a lot of benefits that could be achieved by deploying those grid enhanced technologies. And this is why for the last couple of years, we have been a strong proponent of those technologies. We via comments at FERC or trying to raise the profile of those technologies at the RTO level. For instance, in SPP, as part of a new roadmap initiative, we submitted initiatives around having processes or incentives in place to vet those technologies, to look at those technologies. But the process has been slow. So we really believe that there needs to be kind of like a top-down approach for those technologies to be implemented broadly and to achieve the benefits that the Watt Coalition study has shown, and the benefits that we are seeing ourselves in the studies. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. That's a fantastic perspective. Over to you, Nora.
Great, thanks. I want to emphasize a point that Radhika made, because I think we've referenced it in the studies in a number of ways. Jay referenced it, but the economic cost of congestion, of dysfunctional and delayed interconnection queues, of the lack of transparency and data is enormous. Joe Edo did a great study on hidden congestion cost and their cost to customers and to the economy generally. And I want to emphasize that while these technologies provide a number of solutions, they also have significant impact on reducing costs that ultimately get passed on to ratepayers. And so the investment in these kinds of technologies, which people really need to focus on, is de minimis compared to the benefits that it brings. But I want to talk a little bit about how we can get this jump started, because some of these technologies have been around for a long time. This is a great study to really demonstrate with living examples why we can't avoid and shouldn't avoid upgrading our networks with these opportunities. FERC can do a number of things. And by the way, I'm thrilled that Congress is looking at it, because it's like we're all together marching in the same direction for the first time in a long time. But FERC has a lot of authority. They can enact incentives, and people say, well, why should we incent utilities to do what they should be doing anyway? The fact of the matter is the business model is based on large capital projects bringing a return. So low capital isn't encouraged, even if it brings these advantages. So I think FERC should immediately reopen the issue of incentives, as they've said that they're going to look. They also have a planning docket that they've talked about. And given the data that these technologies provides, I think this will be an important part of their discussions. But frankly, FERC can do more than incentives, and there's a variety of incentives. I think they should hold RTOs accountable. I think RTOs should stand up in a technical conference and talk about what they're doing to provide the leadership that is necessary to get these deployed quickly and to deal with the issue of the cost, I think, inequities in these interconnection queues where the developer pays significant more costs than I think are probably necessary or even fair. I think the leadership of the RTOs, both including the boards, and FERC has said they're going to look at governance issue, should be evaluated by how much they're doing to provide the leadership and the transparency that we need to get the deployment and to get people to understand. I think FERC can hold a number of technical conferences to educate people on the opportunities that obviously this study identifies, to help people understand why we need to do this, why we need to do it now, and what the benefits are. Because I don't think the world, and certainly a lot of state commissions, have the wherewithal to really get the understanding of the enormous impact very small capital investments can make. And I think there's a whole bunch of different kinds of things they can do instead of the traditional. They're just opening an office of public participation. I think they ought to ask customers what they want to see from their grid and how they can contribute to leading the effort, both with public policymakers on a local level. Were I a local mayor or a governor listening to what's happening in Kansas, for example, I would be pounding the drums for these. But I think FERC is in a unique position, particularly because they clearly have the support of Congress and a lot of stakeholders who are committed to a carbon-free economy and more renewables, but also who want affordability, which is first and foremost on everybody's mind. And I think we also need to respect the fact that these climate events are not black swan events. I keep hearing that. Fires and drought in Texas are not black swan events. Winter storms all over the place that are more severe are not black swan events. Rudy can talk about some of the things he's seen in the Northeast. So I think we need to be realistic about what we're confronting, not only as we transform our networks and our generation fleets, but as we look at these externalities, which are well out of our control in many ways, but certainly we can anticipate that we don't know maybe what they are or how often they are, but they are a real part of our future. These are really simple solutions. Now, those who invented them would say they're not quite as simple as I'm making them, but they're simple and easy and quick to deploy. And I think that's the important message. So I hope FERC jumps on this. I hope we all do, because I think the Chair Castor really invited us to comment to our members, and I think we should all be active in that. So thanks for this study, which really unearths just some nuggets that even I, who love these kinds of technologies, didn't know about. And I've seen them deployed. I've seen them deployed in California during fire season, and they were enormously beneficial. So I'm excited and can't say enough about how important it is to do everything we can to encourage their deployment.
Thanks so much, Nora. We've been talking so much about the grid. It's really important to bring in some perspectives of grid asset owners. So Al, the floor is yours.
I'm right here. Thank you. So I did develop a quick PowerPoint to walk you through what I'm going to talk about, just to organize myself, because I get so excited about these things and I don't want to go through 20, 30 minutes. I only got 5 minutes here. So with that said, if you go to the next slide, my topic is basically talk about an implementation that we did on DLRs in Kansas. And we picked one of our 345 kV lines in Western Kansas. That line, if you see those red wind farms, is basically, these are wind farms trying to get on the grid, about 1.2 gigawatt that will benefit from that line. That line is actually substation terminal limited. It's not even a conductor limited. However, we are working right now on improving the substation relays and CTs to bring it up to the conductor limits. So when we applied the DLR on this line, we observe interesting results that I'm going to share with you guys. On the right side, on the bottom side here, you could see we looked at all our transmission lines in Western Kansas. And very interesting, our lines either go north to south or east to west. in general, you could see most of our lines are in those directions. So the data that we got today, basically most of what we see in the summertime, we see a south wind coming up, which basically runs perpendicular to this line. And we see north wind in the winter. Okay, so if you really think about the geography there, the data we're showing you here is only could get better if we have the lining from east to west versus north to south. So we'll go to the next slide. So the DLR average percent above static rating. And when we talk about static rating, this is terminal limit static rating that we have on the line. It's about 800 MVA today. And when we applied the data, looking at the ambient temperature, the wind speed, and honestly, the angle where the wind speed hit the wire makes a big difference. We've seen the lowest increase we've seen on the rating is about 24% above the current ratings. And the highest I think we saw is 50%. And most of that happened in the hours of, midday hours of the month. The x-axis, you could see the July 2020 through February 2021. And we didn't even have on average any hour that the dynamic line rating showed less rating than the terminal equipment limitation. Go to the next slide. Since we are upgrading the line and should be in service here in the next month or so, we looked at the same data and we say, if we move the line rating up to 3000 amps, which will be the static rating that we will use normally, and if we projected those DLR data into that line, you could see the difference here, the percent of time that the DLR is actually giving us a higher rating. Also, what the DLR showed us is there are some few hours in that time span where we see the static rating is too high. There is like 3% of the time where, based on wind speed and ambient temperature, the rating is too high and should be a little bit lower. So this is a great thing to look at, because you could increase the rating most of the time. However, if you implement the DLR, you could have visibility over when am I above the static that I assume, when am I below it. Next slide. So this is just a typical day in August of 2020, what we observe. It's amazing that when the temperature gets high in August, we see more wind during the peak hours. That is totally different than what we see in the winter and the spring, but during the summer, very interesting what the DLR showed us here. And that's the time when we have wind generation. We're mostly wind renewable entity. So that wind will cool off the wire and we get more capacity. Next slide. So advantages of using DLR, I put them down here. Congestion management, as I showed you, there's about 1.2 gigawatt of wind trying to connect to the same hub in that area. If I continue maintaining my rating as static rating, there will be congestion. There will be times where I have to build more new lines. As a cooperative load serving entity, we like to save money, and these technologies can save us money. Maintenance outages also is getting complicated. With DLR, we could use that to our advantage. We could potentially reduce future capital transmission, as I mentioned. DLR can be very beneficial overload absorb when adding uncertain loads. Sometimes you have oil and gas load that come in that are uncertain. You want to connect them, you find an overload. If I could use DLR to help me connect these loads until I see the exact megawatt, then I could go build transmission. That could be a time saving. And also DER penetration can change flow on the lines, and using DLR can help us manage that. Next slide. Disadvantages, or I say challenges, how can we incorporate DLR in the transmission planning process? Then how we handle terminal equipment limitation. 36% of my system is terminal equipment limitation. There's also SIP compliance issues, and also the cost allocation challenge. Who pays for those technologies and who benefits from them? So that's all what I have for today. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. And just a reminder for all the participants, please feel free to continue throwing questions into the chat. We should have some time after Rudy's presentation to get to those. Rudy.
Good morning. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Rob, for the invitation, and thanks for all the great work you're doing with the Watt Coalition. I think by way of introduction, I really want to focus some of my comments on what it means to be a transmission owner. Essentially, what are we experiencing? Why do we see GETS as important? And then probably more important, what are we doing and what do I think we need to do going forward? So as mentioned, I'm with National Grid. We are owners of utilities, electric utilities, gas utilities, and transmission businesses in the northeastern US as well as the UK. In the Northeast, we have the largest transmission network, and in the UK, we're the transmission network across England as well as interconnecting England to Europe and most recently on the Viking Line to Denmark. But if I focus my attention on what we're experiencing and seeing in the northeastern US, a few things come to mind. One is high proliferation of distributed generation, even at the local distribution level. We've interconnected just around 1.3 gigawatts of smaller scale DG. We're planned to interconnect probably another gigawatt of small scale DG on our networks going into the future as well. Second, there is a big need to debottleneck some existing renewables that we have, particularly in upstate New York and other parts of the Northeast. Third is the outlook for offshore wind. I think we all know that the US offshore wind market is growing. By the mid-2030s, the US is poised to become probably the fourth largest offshore wind market in the world. In the Northeast, where I operate, we're likely to see upwards of around 15 gigawatts of offshore wind by the mid-2030s. And then the last point I'll make around what we're experiencing is clearly the need to invest in transmission for integrating, as we talked about, the renewables, but also transmission's role in just helping states meet their deep decarbonization goals, especially as we electrify transport and electrify heat as well. So why do we see GETS as important? Number one, the grid is changing. And as a good asset manager of a grid, we need more tools. And we see these grid enhancing technologies as another set of tools that we can use. And you use the right tool for the right situation. As I mentioned, we also have distribution businesses. So we're interacting with those end use consumers. When you do that, we have to show that we are good stewards and good asset owners. One really good way of doing that is to show that we're doing everything we can to sweat the existing assets, right? How do we optimize the existing assets as much as we can before we have to build new assets? So absolutely, grid enhancing technologies can be economic and drive affordability by reducing congestion, but we also see it as a tool to just be more efficient and in how we deploy our capital. So we just see it as something we're going to use and we started using and continue using to help drive affordability to our end use customers. And finally, the other benefit we see and people spoke about before is speed. It is something that can help us integrate renewables at a faster pace. So what are we doing? As I mentioned, we see this as just one tool. So obviously we're looking and we have deployed some dynamic line rating devices on our distribution network, on our transmission network. We've looking at topology optimization software and evaluating a new grid. We've deployed some of the other advanced power flow devices on our networks here in the US and the UK as well. But we just see them as part of a broader initiative around making our transmission network that much smarter. So our big focus is on deploying technology to help us get data and intelligence so we make better decisions. It also is around focusing on things like we're talking about today, whether it's power flow control devices or battery energy storage to help us integrate renewables, et cetera. And then third, our big area of focus is also on monitoring these assets and utilizing either online network monitoring or robotics to help us monitor the asset health. But having said that, and as I said, we've deployed a lot, more needs to be done. So I look forward to the conversation today, but I would just leave us with 5 key things that I think need to be done and looked at and executed going into the future. Number 1, as I mentioned, we see GETS as a tool, but just one of a large tool set we want to deploy as an asset manager. So we do believe, and I believe, that GETS needs to be part of a real national energy innovation mission, right? Number 2, we need much more wide-scale deployment of these technologies. So we as owner and operators of transmission can learn about them, and at the same time, we can educate our RTOs and ISOs about them and their use in real-life situations. As I mentioned, we've deployed some of these devices, particularly in areas where I had high degrees of DG proliferation, and it has reduced constraints on the network. Third, I would just make the point that this does not mitigate the need to still upgrade and install new infrastructure to create some headroom that we're going to need on these networks in order to enable that clean energy future. The fourth point I would make is, in our experience, it works well when you have a much more holistic view of system planning, weaving in, where do policy goals need to take us, as well as reliability. And then the final point I think Nora mentioned earlier was making sure we have a supportive regulatory model behind it as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rudy. I'd like to go ahead and invite the rest of our panelists to come back. And got a lot of really good questions. We'll see how many we can get to in the remaining 10 minutes. Rudy, I think picking up on a point you were just making, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being trivial and 10 being impossible, how would you rate the regulatory and operational barriers facing widespread deployment of GETS? And maybe Rudy, you can kick things off, and then maybe we can hear from Nora after that.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start off by saying, when we have the benefit of having a business in the US and a business in the UK, and we've seen our business in the UK probably much more active around this, and that's largely because of a very supportive regulatory environment that encourages use of innovation and deployment of new technologies. Our big driver here in the US was, quite frankly, around making sure our networks were always an enabler and not an inhibitor of public policy, right? So there is probably more that can be done on a regulatory model, but I wouldn't say that is a major inhibitor, because we're deploying it now. But let's be clear, when I said I've deployed it, we've had these on our networks for almost a year now. There's so much more that needs to be done. So I don't know if I'd rate it on either end of the spectrum, but I do think it is absolutely doable to get a supportive regulatory environment in place.
So I would just add to that, having served on Rudy's board, I've seen the differences in the regulatory model, and I think the UK does much more effectively reward innovation. In fact, they drive innovation. And from everything that I've heard from the new FERC, I think that's exactly where they're going. I think they understand that that is their role. And because they're looking at this, again, as Rudy said, from a holistic perspective, they're looking at planning, they're looking at governance, they're looking at climate change. I think they'll quickly realize, if they haven't already, that GETS actually answers a lot of the questions they're trying to get to. Particularly, I think, with regard to planning, you can't underestimate the importance of the data, and I've said that before. And being able to verify data by independent sources, which some of these sensors and technologies can do. So I'm confident that our regulators have the tools if they want to use them. And I'm quite sure that both Congress and FERC are on the right path to get us where we need to go. I think the challenge is having stakeholders, to include state commissions, really understand fully the benefits that these technologies can bring.
Thanks,
will-
thanks, Nora. Oh,
I would
go ahead,
like to,
Radhika.
yeah, I would like to add to that, that based on kind of like all our discussions and the studies we have looked at and done, I think in some parts like New York ISO, the interest is aligned. The state has clean energy goals, significant, ambitious goals. There is an acknowledgement that there needs to be a lot of transmission infrastructure built and optimized. And the commission is very open to integrated grid enhanced technologies. So everything is aligned. I think in other RTOs, there is this maybe culture shift that needs to happen between, like, you look at transmission constraints that have been identified in the planning process as economic needs versus looking at any constraint and maximizing, like trying to reduce congestion. Not, for instance, topology optimization is something that doesn't cost almost anything, so those could be implemented from a day to another, basically. So, but I feel like it's this shift that needs to happen, evidently all the time having reliability in mind, but from, like, you have to address identify needs, economic needs, versus looking at maximizing the system in any interval, which can be done without that particular constraint to be defined and cataloged as a identified approved economic need.
Thanks, Radhika. And Al, actually, I think picking up on what Radhika just said, we had a question about, how can we increase coordination between, utilities and developers and regulators such that these things can happen in tandem? And are there opportunities for stakeholders to engage with utilities on the planning and use of these technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I just want to start, first of all, physics are physics, and sometimes you just have to take care of those terminal equipment limitations, because all the technologies we're talking about today, if you don't take care of a facility that is 60, 70 years old, that has a limitation on the substation, conductor doesn't mean anything to us. Most of the congestion that we see lasts 1 to 4 hours, and a lot of times is about 4 or 5% extra capacity is what we need. And we curtail and do all the kind of stuff. But I think there should be a roadmap to implement these technologies. The roadmap should start with what are the physical limitations today beside the conductor, and have a roadmap to upgrade the grid and get it up to speed. So this way we're not limited by a CT ratio in a substation, or a relay can't protect a line. You know what I mean? If you do the data and you investigate how often RTOs and the utility can work together to identify what are those limiting elements and how much hours are they binding and how much interruption to the existing market and the future projections of renewables to be connected. It has to start from the bottom and try to start drawing a roadmap to solve these nagging problems that happen year after year after year, and nobody is doing it. We're getting the technology. Technology works for 60, 70% of my transmission system, but the rest of it, I'm still obligated to fix those physics issues. So I think the utility with the RTOs can start looking at this data, start looking at the magnitude of market disruptions or whatever you're gonna say, and look about 10 years out. How are we gonna get that done to incorporate all of these together to work toward a better future on renewable integration, and at the end of the day, customer bills. We'll pay a lot less money if we enable the renewables to reach the load. Right now in Kansas, I do have 3.5 gigawatt of wind on a system that is 1 gigawatt. So I'm like 350% penetration. Any congestion I have in my footprint, it's going to impact the whole SPP market. So we need to start focusing on those what we call wind-rich zones and facilitate how can we get these renewables to the hubs. And a lot of time you will see a little dinky substation causing tons of congestion under N-1, and you don't know what to do about it. And I don't know why we're spinning our wheels instead of really tackling the problem. Let's do the math, let's identify, prioritize, do a roadmap, and get rid of these minor little CTs or relays or bus bar that need to be switched to enable to open the grid. So I think the utility and the RTO can work together and try to facilitate that. But everything starts with the data and the facts without being biased toward who pays and whatever. Cost allocation, that's a whole different story. But I think let the planners do the planning before discussing cost allocation. Cost allocation is important, extremely important. But let's identify what are the problems, what are the fixes, and let's make sure cost allocation fairly allocate the cost to the cost causers.
Thanks, Al, and thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks for that call to action. I think I hope everybody enjoyed today's discussion, and I wish we had a lot more time. We really ran out of time here to get to a lot more questions. But feel free to reach out to the Watt Coalition and to the panelists to continue to follow up. I'd just like to thank the Brattle Group again and the study funders and to all our speakers today for making today's event such a success. And please visit the Watt website at watt-transmission.org. You can download the report and share the webinar recording with your colleagues. We really look forward to engaging with you and the broader industry on how we can leverage these findings to accelerate an affordable and efficient energy transition. I think that's why we're all here. So thank you again, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Lots of fun.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.